Elmer, what are you doing?
Oh, I'm annealing my brass.
Are you sure you know what you're doing?
Oh, annealing's when you use some heat and you get your brass hot, but you only want it on the neck and the shoulders, and then you clinch it, and now it makes the brass softer.
You surprise me every day, Elmer. You didn't even get that very hot.
Oh, trust me, you don't want to get this too hot. You will ruin the entire thing. It will be no good whatsoever anymore. You have to be really careful with this stuff.
You know that's not doing anything, right?
What do you mean it's not doing a thing? It keeps the necks from cracking, makes this more consistent. It does everything that you're supposed to do with it. I learned this method from my granddad, and I tell you what, it works. But it's really nice to have this torch. You take it through the flame, and you knock it right into the water, and you're good to go. One of the questions I've had about the annealing process as I've been going through this, and especially working on my annealing ladder, is what are the actual hardnesses if you were to measure the hardness? So I took 6 pieces of brass and I annealed them just as I would in an annealing ladder. I had one that was as fired, so no annealing done to it. I had one that was annealed at half a second. Next one was at 1 second. Next one was at 1.5 seconds. And then the last one was done at 1.9 seconds, which is where I had been doing my annealing for that particular brass at that time. And then the last one here I also did at 1.9 seconds, but before I went and did the profiles on it, I went and sized it to the point where it was ready to have a bullet seated in it. What I found was very interesting. It leaves me with a ton of questions, and I'll get to some of these questions here in a minute. But I think there's a lot more to be had on the annealing front than what a lot of people are getting to at the moment. We've improved a lot of case life and consistency issues with the annealing, but is there really more? What effect is there? Is it significant? All that sort of stuff really comes to my mind now that I've seen these results. So let's talk about it. Without annealing, you would expect this one to be the hardest, right? And of course it was. That was approximately within a few points of the hardest pieces that we have. The point that we're annealing on these is also just like the neck and shoulder region. It's not really going down the case. So we're hoping to see that softening up higher in the case and it being harder as it works on down the case. If we do see it softening on down the case, we know that we are getting too soft too far down, and that could lead to some potential issues because we want that hardness for the safety of firing these. When these were tested, they tested them at a number of different points on down the length of the case. So the first hardness test was done at the mouth, at the neck, like up, as close as you can kind of get to the mouth of the case. The next point was measured on the shoulder. Actually, it was measured about 65 thousandths below the shoulder. So it wasn't like exactly up on the shoulder, but it should give you some idea of what the shoulder is relative to the rest of the case and how far that is starting to work its way down. From that point, we go in 100 thousandths increments. So this was 100 thousandths below that for the next measurement, and so on and so forth until you get to 500 thousandths, so a half inch below that initial shoulder measurement. All of this testing was done with micro Vickers hardness. So the values that we're going to be talking about here are hardness Vickers HV numbers. So what were these values? All right, so start with the one that had no anneal to it. We expect this to be the hardest, and it was. But how does this actually progress as we get to the ones that have been annealed and annealed in size? Well, we can stack all of them over top of one another, and we can see this graph here. We see that we have cases that are getting softer as they go at the mouth region, but every single one of those is already returning to the same hardness or pretty close to at the shoulder measurement. Then as we get on down into the rest of the measurements, they're all basically the same hardness. So that is very good. That means that we are only annealing up where we want it to be annealed at. But how is the progression at that mouth changing as we change our anneal time? So with no anneal being the hardest, half a second anneal was basically the same exact hardness. Even though it was hot to the touch when it came out of the annealing machine, it had no change in hardness yet. It wasn't hot for long enough. And that is a point I've made over and over again, that you need time and temperature. Next one, 1 second. 1 second anneal. This one was starting to get much toastier. I don't know the exact temperatures these were at, and it doesn't really matter. But my hardness on it had dropped by about 20 points. We're starting to see that drop in hardness that we would expect at this point. Next one's 1.5 seconds. We lost another 30 points worth of hardness. This point is very interesting. It's 1.5 seconds. Because that is where I started to see a little bit of a dull red glow. What's also very interesting about that point is that that Vickers hardness measurement was about 90. And a lot of AMP's research seems to indicate that they are looking for that 90 to 100 range on theirs. And I'm thinking they're actually maybe in the 95 to 98 range, somewhere in there. Not exactly sure, but I'm pretty sure that's what they target with their profiles. Why is that? Well, maybe that's a discussion for another day. But 1.9 seconds. So you'd expect some more drop on this, right? If we're still going down, we could still, that bottom of that S-curve can still see a drop in hardness as we're going. And we did. We saw another 24 points in hardness drop. So that was pretty soft. I've dropped some cases that have been annealed at that level, and just them hitting the floor will dent the mouth cases. So it is pretty soft, no doubt about it. But what happens when you go back and you size it? What difference does that make at that point? And it's pretty remarkable. It went all the way back up to as hard as our as fired case. So what does that mean? I don't know. There are a lot of people out there who believe that if you over anneal, they see these cases glowing like I get them glowing, and they think, it's ruined, you ruined the case. And that is not it at all. I recovered that hardness all the way back up to as fired. Can we go harder? Yes, absolutely. That's why we get neck cracking if we don't anneal it. But that does tell me that we didn't ruin the case and we recovered the hardness. Those are two conclusions that I am strongly in support of at the moment, that you cannot make brass unrecoverable. You cannot make it too soft. We can work harden it back up to where it's supposed to be. But the big question that I have here, big question that I don't think anybody has really answered yet, and maybe they have and I just don't know about it. What hardness should this be? What hardness gives you the most consistent results? Because you have two things at play here. Even if AMP takes that case and they're aiming for that 90 to 100, what happens when you size the case and you get hardness back into it? There's no guidelines for how much you should be resizing that case back at that point. What if someone does 6 thousandths worth of sizing versus 20 thousandths worth of sizing? I don't know, I'm just making numbers up. Those are going to have pretty dramatically different hardnesses. They got a lot more work in one versus the other. AMP did do some research on bullet pull force, and that will correlate really closely to the neck tension here. But they didn't really seem to correlate the hardness of the brass to what is the best bullet pull force results. What gets you the most consistency there? Is it just simply a matter of, can I get it to be as consistently hard as possible? Which I think this does. When we get down to somewhere that is flattening out on our S-curve, and I think that gets us much better sizing results and much more consistent hardnesses. But what hardness do we take it back to? Where do we go from there with it? Now, in metallurgy, a lot of forming, like if you think of can forming, they use fully hardened aluminum in can forming just because that gets them the most consistent results, and they're doing stuff in compression to where it will actually form and take that without cracking. So fully hardened is going to be actually the most consistent. But we can't have fully hardened or else it's going to crack. Where do we balance this out? Where do we get these results? I don't know. The problem with these kind of things leaves me with more questions than answers. But very interesting results to see this change in hardness. See that drop off. You can start to see that S-curve. Maybe if I did some more in between, I'd be able to see a more defined S-curve, see how far I can take it out beyond that 1.9 seconds. But for now, judge my results with what you will, and maybe if we can get enough people supporting this channel, I will buy a hardness tester. These things are expensive, and add this up as a service for people if they want to do hardness profiles of their brass as well. Thanks for watching.